This is My Taste is Better Than Yours, the manga podcast where Guardian Enzo and I, Samu, discuss some of our favourite series and figure out, is my taste better than yours?
Hello again, everybody. It's your old pal Guardian Enzo coming to you live from snowy Kyoto, Japan. And I will apologize in advance. Last time around it was Samu. This time around it's me who's fighting a bit of a cold as we record this evening. In any event, we're going to start off. I wanted to describe what we're going to do this evening. And what I'm calling this episode is What Makes a Big Shonen Hit. This is kind of a thought experiment that I came up with that I wanted to try and really tap Samu's expertise to get his take on this to a large extent, but also my own. As someone who's observed anime side of it, especially for a long time, Samu is certainly more versed in the manga side. So we've done the next big thing. We've done that in the olden days on RC. We did it on an LIA podcast. We did an episode about it on My Taste. This is not the next big thing, though. This is a look trying to understand, deconstruct why some series become kaiju and why most do not. And to define the term, I want to talk about the definition. That's something we're going to discuss. But broadly speaking, we're talking about a huge shonen hit. Now, we're talking specifically about shonen here. There are kaiju in other demos as well, but we're talking specifically about shonens here. Obviously, at one end of the spectrum, you can have something like One Piece and Kimetsu. Those are the two most obvious that come to mind to me at the high end of the spectrum. Indisputably, monstrously gargantuan. What the other end of the spectrum is, what's the cutoff point to be called a kaiju? I'm not sure exactly what it is, whether we have to point to an exact number of manga volumes sold, or whether there's kind of a social penetration level or an international popularity level. I'm going to let Simon weigh on this, but just to give you an idea, without quantifying it too much, kind of at the opposite, the low end of the kaiju spectrum for me would be like maybe Hero Aka and Haikyuu. Those would be two I would definitely would consider kaiju, but they're probably about where the cutoff is for me on anything that level or bigger. So why don't you just give me your general thoughts on this whole what is a kaiju question and how you define it, both kind of in your own head and for the purposes of our conversation today.
I think Haikyuu is a good measure. I mean, I'm looking over it now. Haikyuu has 70 million volume sales. If you do want to go off of volume sales, that is a pretty good metric that's easy to go by. But there are some series that don't necessarily have as much sales, but you can feel that they have something in the like cultural zeitgeist and the way that they've appealed to as many people as they have. And also these smaller series, I think the time of these super long running shonen series is it's not over, but it's less common than it used to be. We just had My Hero Academia ending, which was 42 volumes, I believe. I don't think there's many new series that could be potential kaijus that are probably even going to get to that many volumes. I would think. So yeah, but then on the other hand, you have things like Demon Slayer, which how many volumes does that have? Demon Slayer has 23 volumes. So and then look at what that can do. So I think I'm kind of where you are in terms of cutting off, but looking over that list of like what would fall below that, there are a couple other ones that I would include as exceptions to.
Okay, that's that. Let's go off by script here, and then because that leads me to what I think is an interesting kind of a sidebar question. Give me one or two examples of series you would consider kaiju that might not immediately spring to mind for most people as being kaiju.
You could go back further in time to ones that maybe people aren't talking about as much nowadays. I would say things like Fist of the North Star in its own era. That is definitely that sort of series. Around that time as well, you have basically Mitsuru Adachi series, Touch.
Mm.
His
Well,
other
that's
one,
kaiju in any definition, touch, but we'll
sure.
yeah,
Well, to a lesser degree than H2, that's another
yeah, yeah.
one which is very, very popular. Obviously, didn't reach the levels of Touch, but I think that's about 50, 55 million. So that's nothing to sneeze at either. Then you have, when you think of other more recent series that maybe haven't had the longevity to establish that, I think of Freyren and Apothecary Diaries, very, very recent
Mm,
examples. Even something like Spy Family,
mm,
those those series would not qualify if you're using, say, Haikyuu or something around that level for that
mm.
metric. But they
But they
do
could
feel
get
like,
there.
yeah, they could get there, and they do feel like there's a moment. Uh, we're having a moment with them.
Mm.
So yeah, I think those
Certainly,
are if
Spy
you.
Family. Certainly, Spy Family. I agree with that. And those are all three you mentioned. Those are all shonen, demographically
Yeah,
speaking, are they not? Yeah, they're not maybe not what we sometimes think about as being kind of archetypical shonen.
yeah.
And
I don't know if Apothecary Diaries, maybe that has its own because it's a light novel. Maybe that
right.
is somewhat of an outlier. But yes, the other two definitely.
Well, you know that I teach in Japanese public schools. Some of our listeners know that. I know you know that. Among
Hmm.
my many jobs I do to survive, but I do some of the time I teach, and some of the kids I teach are junior high school kids, and it's interesting. Um, Free Rent and Apothecary Diaries are kind of joined at the hip as commercial entities. People always talk about them, including me, guilty as charged, talk about them as a pair because they hit anime at the same time, and their sales have been really, really almost mirrored each other. I mean, Free Rent consistently just a bit more, just a bit more, just a bit more. But I will tell you that demographically speaking, Apothecary Diaries definitely skews younger than free rent does. Like among fifth grade elementary through third grade junior high school, which would actually be ninth grade in the states. Um, like Mao Mao is like an icon. Everybody knows Mao Mao.
Oh, really?
But if you show Free Ren or Stark or Fern, maybe some kids will know and some won't. So I mentioned at the beginning, I thought One Piece and Demon Slayer Kimetsu are the two most obvious
Hmm.
candidates here, but for different reasons. Now, One Piece, even if it only had a year or two of sales at its average volume sales, now would still be a kaiju. But the thing that makes One Piece so exceptional, why before Demon Slayer came around, it was the monster shonen of all time, and no one disputed it, is the longevity. Whereas with Kimetsu, obviously it ran for a much much shorter stretch of time than One Piece is running. But if you look at a per volume average, and if you look at the amount of revenue it generated in other respects besides volume sales, Kimetsu had a 3 year run that was bigger than anything else in the history of anime and manga. I don't think you can even argue that. So, in your estimation, which is the biggest kaiju in Shonen Jump or Shonen history? Is it Kimetsu or is it One Piece?
Well, I like that you already took what I was gonna, how I was gonna split them with. Demon Slayer has the average volume, which I believe if you want to split it by that, it's 6.5 million per volume. Obviously, that's not actually how
Wow.
it's going to sell, but that is in content. Like there's nothing else. There's no other series that reaches that.
No, no,
Uh,
none.
and Demon Slayer, it does, even though it's ended for quite a few years now, it still feels like it's around because of this anime adaptation, which Ufotable is taking their time with. But that is going to come to an end in the next couple of years. So it does feel like Demon Slayer has reached its peak, and whereas when you think about One Piece, no, it didn't get to the peak of Demon Slayer did, but there is something about its longevity, and if you want to look at numbers in another way, it does have the most sales. It probably will always have the most sales of any manga series that we'll ever see. It feels like it's going to be around for quite a bit longer and just be part of the cultural zeitgeist. And because it has been more in the culture for a longer time than Demon Slayer, I would lean towards One Piece. I think in the if you ask this question in 20 years' time, I think more people would. It's a hard question.
That's a
I
hard
still
one.
go.
That's a hard
I,
one.
I still go with One Piece. I think One Piece has permeated across.
Mm.
Oh, even as I'm saying this, I was going to say it permeates across different generations of those who have read it over 20 some years. But then you have Demon Slayer, which managed to permeate across all these generations in just a few years, and it managed to appeal to
Yes,
everyone at the same time.
yes,
But
which
yes,
is
I'm
more
still,
remarkable in a way when you think about it.
yeah, I'm still going to go with One Piece.
Okay,
That's my gut instinct. What's your
fair
answer?
enough. And I have to say that I agree with you that if I have to pick one, I will give it to Oda just for the managing to keep the series as popular as it is for this long. But the level of popularity that Kimetsu achieved with different age groups is truly, truly, truly unmatched, unparalleled. Old people love that series. You people in other countries may not realize it. In Japan, seniors were huge Kimetsu fans. It was a huge hit, and it was a series that would like grandmas and grandpas were enjoying with their grandkids and stuff, which is pretty amazing. And I've already done a whole video about trying to figure out why Kimetsu was so big, so I won't rehash that whole thing now. But I do think you have to give it up for a series to be able to be so wide reaching in its appeal. It's not even One Piece can match it in that respect. Now, I'm just curious. Do you know? Did Oda ever publicly comment about the popularity of Kimetsu and how he felt about it? Because it was really the only thing that ever came along and threatened his place as the undisputed king of the Shonen Hill.
I can't think of anything. He may well have. And there's nothing coming to mind. But what I do know, which was quite funny when it happened, when the final volume of Demon Slayer came out, that came out alongside, around the same time as a One Piece volume, and Shueisha, what they did was they almost underpublished the final Demon Slayer volume.
I
Some
remember
people
that.
think, some people saying that is because they didn't want to take away the
Yeah,
record that One Piece had earlier in its run.
I
Uh,
remember that. I remember that.
so
Yes.
I have no idea if that has anything to do with Oda himself. That might just be Shueisha them not wanting to undercut what they have with One Piece. But that is potentially a little bit of behind the scenes
You do wonder.
business.
It's human nature to wonder, isn't it? I mean, because he had a long run where no one would even have. It would never have occurred to anyone to ask the question I asked. So that was a big change when Kimetsu came along. Now, so how big a factor is the publication and or the publisher in a series' ability to reach this status? Now, obviously, a weekly Shonen Jump series probably has a better chance than a non-weekly Shonen Jump series, and a Shueisha series has a better chance than a non-Shueisha series. But how much of a factor do you think that is in whether a series reaches that mythical cutoff point for Kaiju?
Yes, I think it does. It matters more than it doesn't. I think of something like I think it's Weekly Shonen Champion where Iruma-kun runs. Iruma-kun and all the
Mm.
various spin-offs that basically run that magazine. That keeps that magazine going. That is,
Well,
would you,
Bokuyama's in that magazine too, but well, no, it's not. It's in Champion Cross. It's biweekly, so I'll give you that. Okay.
to answer your question, I'm going to ask you a question. Would you consider Iruma-kun as the franchise that it's become? Is that a kaiju or is that something
No,
a little less?
no, it's a little less.
Okay,
It's
so it's still
big.
definitely a
It's
hit.
real big. It's real big. It's a huge hit. Very popular, including among my school kids, but not a kaiju. No,
Yeah.
it
Okay,
misses the
so
cutoff.
Iruma-kun in relation to that magazine is massive. Like
Yep.
nothing competes with it. But in the grand scheme of things, it is not, like you say, it's not a kaiju. So you
Yep.
have, if something is going to be a success, it's probably going to be from the usual suspects that you would expect. Weekly Shonen Jump, Magazine, Sunday. Uh, if we're just limiting to Shonen, and there are a couple other ones as well that creep in there from time to time. I mean, Sunday, bringing that up, they obviously have Detective Conan, which is just a staple in
That's a
Japanese
kaiju.
society. That's a
That's a
kaiju.
kaiju. Yep.
And recently they did have Freyren. Between then, I don't know if they've necessarily had a kaiju that's outside of Rumiko Takahashi.
Mm.
So they were kind of not delivering if you want to measure it by that metric. Magazine, I mean, I think was it last year was the first time that a weekly Shonen Jump series for a long, long time wasn't the number one Oricon best-selling manga with Blue Lock. Blue Lock took that,
Mm.
so that's
And that's a
magazine.
kaiju. That's a kaiju.
So yeah, I think you're looking at the usual suspects, but it's not to say that a slightly less popular magazine can't have a hit. I think the ratio of it is just much less likely.
Okay, I'll buy that. I mean, you look at the non-Shueisha kaiju titles in recent memories. Uh, Tokyo Revengers, um, for sure. Blue Lock, Conan, which is like you said has been around since Moses. Um, uh, but there aren't that many. So I think your answer is kind of where I fall on this. It's not a prerequisite that it be a Jump series or even a Shueisha series, but it sure makes it more likely. It sure as hell makes it more likely. Um, Here's an interesting question. I think. What is a series you do? You Is there a series for you that you distinctly remember thinking, "Oh, this is going to be a kaiju. This is going to make that," and it didn't? Is there a series or two that springs to mind for you where that would be the case?
I okay. The main one I think of, and again, this comes down to whether you define something as kaiju or just a massive hit. Quite recent, it's even still publishing, is Chainsaw Man. Uh,
Mm,
I think that has partly that is down to the anime adaptation, which I don't think the anime is bad by any means. It's very divisive and people are split on it. Though generally, if you ask the average anime fan, they all enjoyed it. I think maybe just what Mappa has been doing in terms of the pace of the series, they've maybe not capitalized on like keeping that momentum while the series is running, especially. And then even looking at it from the manga as well. Part one of Chainsaw Man, it peaked with the end of that, with the announcement of the anime. Part two, we have seen Fujimoto take the series, and he took the series in left turns before, but he's taken so many left turns that you can't even keep up with what you think is going to happen at any point.
mm.
Which I think I'm still of two minds whether I prefer this second part to the first part, but it seems the consensus of people who were going to buy the manga that they prefer what it was originally.
Mm.
He's gone for something a bit more bold, and I think he's lost some readership because
Okay.
of that. So it's not become the big kaiju that I thought it could have been. Uh, yeah, that's my most recent example. Yeah. Do you have any?
That's exactly the one that was in my mind when I asked the
Okay.
question. If you go back, if you go back into the misty past, the mists of time, and think about that LIA podcast that we did a few years ago, where we specifically talked about the next big thing, and the two series, of course, that we discussed in that podcast were Spy Family and Chainsaw Man. And because at the time, those were the two, both of us agreed indisputably were the two most likely candidates to be the next kaiju. But both were going to premiere as anime soon, but had not premiered as anime yet. And um, I remember during that discussion that I noted that while it seemed like the bulk of consensus was that Chainsaw Man was the more likely to win that duel, if you will, that I kind of thought Spy Family would pull the upset there because Spy Family had a broader reach in terms of audience than Chainsaw Man. That the intensity of the fandom for Chainsaw Man was sky high, but that intensity is typically less predictive of kaiju status than breadth of audience. And Spy Family seemed to me that it had a wider pool of people it could eventually appeal to. And not to toot my own horn, but I think that's exactly what happened. In fact, that Spy Family it won the commercial battle over Chainsaw Man. Now I don't think we can argue that point. It is now commercially a bigger series than Chainsaw Man is, and I think that's the reason, because it has a much broader appeal in terms of age groups, in terms of non-otaku fans. I mean, Chainsaw Man, it reminds me a little bit of the fandom for Chainsaw Man reminds me a bit of Tokyo Ghoul, actually, in that you have a fan base. It has a probably a little bit bigger fan base than Tokyo Ghoul had when it crossed over to anime, but you have a very, very intensely dedicated and loyal and critical fan base who wound up being very dissatisfied, in fact, with the anime versions of both series. I think the general public liked the Chainsaw Man anime pretty well, like you said, but a lot of the hardcore manga readers kind of hated it, and that's how they felt about Tokyo Ghoul 2, both the very fairly faithful first season and the less faithful Tokyo Ghoul option key, whatever that other thing was. So,
I was
although
gonna
that, go ahead.
I was gonna say I think there's another series. This is very early days to be saying this. As you're describing the reception of anime only viewers versus manga readers, we're seeing that with Sakamoto Days as well. Mind you, I think the Chainsaw Man anime is just a lot better done than the Sakamoto Days anime. But I am also already seeing this discrepancy in takes and people's opinions on uh, what they think of the series. And I do think as a result, we are going to see Sakamoto Days not being a kaiju unless something does change in this core, the second core. I think we're seeing that with that series play out in real time as well.
All right, that's fair enough.
I just wanted to say one more thing as well, because you mentioned
Yeah,
about
yeah.
how it appeals to Spy Family winning over Chainsaw Man. It's not leagues above it. I think it's 38 million to 30 million, but Spy Family definitely won. The other one to compare that to is what we're seeing with Apothecary Diaries and Free Ren as well. I think
I agree.
it's not as clear cut, but I think, like you're saying, Apothecary Diaries, even though last year it did lose out to Free Ren, I think it is actually overtaking it now. And if we're looking at just based on the amount of volume sales it has already, Apothecary Diaries is already at Spy Family level, 38 million, and Free Ren is quite a
Right.
bit behind, at 22.
Well, that's
So
partly because Free Rent has become one of the new hiatus kings too, though.
true, it has less
That's part of
releases.
that.
I'm seeing a little similarity in Apothecary Diaries maybe winning out because it has a broader appeal, a la Spy Family.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I actually I do think it has a broader appeal than Free Rent. Although if Free Rent were publishing, consistently without hiatuses, I don't know, because historically, it was always just a little bit ahead of Apothecary Diaries. I want to talk about one more thing before we get into the main event here, which is video sales. And it's not nearly as true now as it used to be, but there was a period, maybe a decade ago, where Blu-ray and DVD sales were a huge, huge component in discussing the overall popularity and profitability of a franchise once it made the transition into anime. And not many series sell a lot of discs nowadays, but even in the days when some series did, typically with big shonen kaiju hits, they never sold nearly as many discs when you compare it to their volume sales as non shonen monster series did. I mean, you would typically have other kinds of series that don't fit that kaiju shonen demographic or that model would do much better on DVD than even really hugely successful shonens, which didn't sell that many discs, even when anime selling discs was a lot more common. Why do you think that is?
I think it just comes down to the otaku fan base that are the ones buying the discs. Those discs are not cheap.
Nope.
So it really did rely on, when that was super relevant, it relied on a small dedicated group of people to carry something through. And I just don't think those sorts of people are drawn to, or ended up being drawn to, the big shonen hits, especially if you look at the big three. Bleach had the best DVD sales throughout its run of the three, even though it's the least popular of the three. So it's just, I don't think there's ever really been a correlation between overall popularity for these big shonen specific titles versus these other potentially more niche otaku appealing anime. getting a boost by that method.
Yeah, and I think if we look at it from that perspective, like if they had come out 10 years ago, Chainsaw Man probably would have outsold Spy Family on Blu-ray, uh, because I think it had the sort of fans who would be more likely to as you say to shell out that kind of money, like $100 equivalent or more for a 2 episode disc. They're buying them as collectibles, and they're. But the thing that people also should understand is that this is a small enough this small enough ecosystem where your fan dollars can make a difference in the profitability and the sustainability of a series, to the point where, if you wanted a series to get another season, the difference between 3,000 disc sales and 4,000 disc sales was huge. So if you dropped the money on a couple of discs, you were actually feeling like you were making a big difference in seeing that series propagate itself. So it's not as true as it used to be, as anime has become an ever bigger business with a ever bigger international footprint, and discs have become less important. Nevertheless, at one time that was huge. But all right, so the main meat of this, let's kind of ease into this, the last portion of the conversation, into the main point, trying to define, not necessarily predictively but even proactively, but define what a kaiju is. And so I'll throw a couple of examples. You mentioned the big three of One Piece, Naruto, Bleach, and then into the 20s even was Kimetsu no Yaiba, Jujutsu Kaisen, and Tokyo Revengers, in that order. So I'll ask you to look at those two trios just to start us off. Do you see commonalities, not necessarily between all six, but let's say even generationally between those two groups of three within the shows within those trios? Do you see common threads in those shows that said, okay, this is why these series specifically became kaiju? Can you point to anything that stands out for you?
Mm, I think if you're comparing the new generation to the older one, there's not. I don't see many similarities between what's carrying over really between them. Tokyo Revengers, I mean, it's from a different magazine, and so it's kind of an outlier. And I don't think that was expected to be as much of a hit as it was. You asked what was a series that we thought was going to be a big hit, but wasn't. And the other end, something that I didn't expect would be, was Tokyo Revengers, mainly because it was a pretty mediocre anime adaptation that elevated it to the degree of popularity that it has. Uh, but yeah, so that's a little bit of an outlier. I think Demon Slayer, and Jujutsu Kaisen. I I would say this because I'm a Bleach fan. I see a lot of Bleach in both of those series, and that's kind of the similarity I would draw between them. I don't know. Do you want to go more on like a broad level of like what makes something a kaiju? What makes it a hit?
Let's try this. What do you see in Bleach, in both of those shows, that you think specifically, what quality of bleachiness do you see in those two series that contributes to their having been huge?
Oh, great! I get to talk about Bleach. I think what a lot of people will say is, even people who are not super big fans of the series, of which there are a lot, that what Bleach monopolizes expertly is the power of coolness, just how badass and cool and visually stylish everything is. I
Okay.
think both those series, I can see in the craft of those series, and I think in particular with Jujutsu Kaisen, Gachiakuta has mentioned Taitako as one of his major influences. And there are, without getting into specific points, there are story beats in both those series, which I think mirror what we see in Bleach. And it's pretty common. There are common tropes in Battle Shonen manga, but the captains in Bleach versus the Hashirama and Demon Slayer, and there's just lots of individual elements that I can see. If we're comparing it to the big three, it is the most similar aesthetically and in terms of individual plot points than say Naruto, and definitely not One Piece. I don't see One Piece much in any of these new series, which I think is kind of credit to how individual One Piece's identity is,
Okay.
on that way. So yeah, I think if you ever do read Bleach, I think it will be interesting to see, in the same way that a lot of series has influenced that. I would say Seiya and Yu Yu Hakusho influenced Bleach, how that carries through into this generation, because none of these, at this point, a lot of these ideas are kind of just recycled. It's repurposed in how they're made to appeal to a new generation and how they take
Right.
a spin on these genre conventions. And if you're familiar with different generations and how things have been done, then yeah, it's interesting to look at it from that level. Yeah.
Well, okay, so let's get meta on this then, and talk about specifically. Now, you talk about the tropes of battle shonen, which I think we all agree that it has them. All rom coms have tropes. Battle shonens have tropes. Sports manga, we know, uh, shonen manga typically, no matter what the genre is, you have your tropes. Nevertheless, uh, we're talking about maybe 1% of the series that are released out there that meet our definition of what is a kaiju. So, what I'm hoping we can at least spend this last portion of the conversation trying to get some sense of is, are there traits, either in terms of their appeal or in terms of their writing or art for that matter, which we can point to and say, okay, this is predictive of achieving kaiju status. Now, I don't think we're going to point to one thing and say, okay, every kaiju battle shonen has this, or every kaiju sports series. Not that there have been that many, but every kaiju sports series has it. But are there common traits that you can point to in these series that do make it versus the ones that don't? Is there something predictive? It's not an easy question to answer. Don't get me wrong. I can look at Naruto. I can look at One Piece. I can look at Tokyo Revengers. I can look at My Hero Academia. It's hard to put together anything and say, okay, it runs through all those, any vein that you can say runs through all those series. But there must be something that is like a gene that makes the development of kaiju status more likely. So, do you see anything that you can point to? Now, we have Battle Shonen, which is, I think, indisputably the most common genre from which kaiju come from. But we have had things like Haikyuu and Touch and Blue Lock in the sports vein.
Slam dunk.
um, Slam Dunk, absolutely. So there are other genres of shonen where you occasionally get the kaiju. I mean, I think Kimetsu very strongly crosses into the fantasy side too, which is another area where they can come from. The sci-fi, you can occasionally get them, but there must be something that ties these together. And I'm wondering if with your vast knowledge of manga and the fact that you do in fact read the number one kaiju producing magazine literally cover to cover every week, do you have any theories on what that might be?
Okay, this is a big question, right?
It is a big question, I know.
Um, I would differentiate the big three. Like, to me, the big three is just the big three: One Piece, Naruto, and Bleach. But if you do want
Okay.
to assign that to other series and different eras and different genres, like you say, you have Slam Dunk, Haikyuu, Blue Lock. Those are or Touch. Those are big sports series. I would say even uh, she's outside of Weekly Shonen Jump, and admittedly, I have not read enough of her to properly talk about why these series are popular. And that's Rumiko Takahashi. She basically
Mm.
has like a big three, if you want to call it that, in Inuyasha, Ranma One
Yasha,
Half,
Ranma,
and
and
Urusei Yatsuru.
yep, yep, yep.
Uh,
And even
Again,
Meisani Koku is close to that, but it's a sign-in. So,
yeah. So it doesn't just come from Weekly Shonen Jump, but I'm definitely Weekly Shonen Jump brained. So
mm,
that's how I'm gonna kind of tackle this. It's a hard one because you could look at it even more broadly. What makes, and if you could go beyond other creative industries, what makes Avatar the most successful film of all time, or Harry Potter for novels? I would argue that neither are particularly high levels of writing and storytelling compared to things that are less popular. There has to be, I think, an oomph. There has to be some sort of like raw energy to it, a spirit that like channels through the main character into the audience, something that they can root for easily and want them to succeed. I think
Mhm.
part of the reason why Demon Slayer is so successful
Yes, Tanjiro
among
is
many reasons.
exactly who sprang to my mind as soon as you made that statement.
Yeah,
Tanjiro.
there's nothing dislikable about Tanjiro, and that's not to say that he's like a Gary Stu. Like he's not a perfect character either, but he's just
No,
utterly. Like, he's just so easy to want to see him succeed.
and I would
Uh,
say Deku fits into that mold too. I would say it's very very hard to dislike Deku. It's very very hard. Some people manage it,
those,
but it's not easy to.
I was going to say some people do. Some people find him a crybaby, which I don't agree with. But uh, obviously, My Hero Academia that's a kaiju as well. So he does fall into that. Luffy with One Piece, Naruto, and then Ichigo, just these characters that they all have very different personalities, but they have a momentum to them that you want to see them like push through the pages and get to
Mm,
what they want. Apart from that, I would say going back to this idea of recycling tropes, taking these familiar ideas which people like and but adding something to them, and like you could have an ingenious concept, something which feels new and fresh, but like takes on some of these ideas that people like. Something like Death Note, for example, there's not that's kind of unique in what it presented, how it was framing the story, but it's not entirely. There are other influences it takes from, but then Battle Shonen, especially, they are taking influences from what's come before. And I think if you do that successfully and manage to make people feel something, even if for the first time, whether it's for the first time, a new generation, or people who have fonder memories of series that channeled that before, I think that is part of the reason why, specifically for Weekly
okay.
Shonen Jump. So yeah, I think it's so hard to pinpoint, but it's almost like the spirit of the series, like the driving push that
Mm.
is felt even beyond things like the artwork and the writing. Does that make
All
sense?
right, now I'm gonna. Yes, it does. I'm gonna throw in my own spin on that and say, here's what I see as someone who is much less widely read in big shonen than you, but nevertheless is not totally unread. I think crucial is quest slash redemption. I think for that main character with the drive you're talking about, having them be really, really relatable and likable is definitely helpful. I also think having them on a quest or having them something that they're something that runs through the whole series, a spine that runs through their arc through the whole series that gives a sense of we're on a journey here. We're starting off with something in mind and we're going to have travails along the way and eventually we're going to get there. I think that helps to draw people along. And I think that, Izuku has that and Tanjiro has that and Luffy has that. And it's not something that's rare in shonen by any stretch of the imagination, but to have it be communicated in a way where it really feels urgent and it you never lose sight of it even when you're taking uh, detours and going off in different directions. You never totally lose the sight of that urgency, that drive, that whether it be redemption, whether it be a redeeming, even with something like Rurouni Kenshin, which I think qualifies as a kaiju actually because of in its day was a huge seller, but it had so many anime adaptations and movies and arcs and live actions and plays. I think it crosses the line. I don't think there's any question that what made Rurouni Kenshin kaiju is that urgency, that drive, that spine of the whole series is Kenshin's need to live to make amends for what he did when he was Hitakiri. And that's the thing that ties the whole series together. And you can't ever watch any sidebar in Rurouni Kenshin without really losing sight. And you never really lose sight of that thing that's driving it forward. I think it's true with Tanjiro and Demon Slayer. So I think that's one commonality I think we see in a lot of these series. So I have one more too, but I want to give. Do you have any rebuttal on that, or what? Any thoughts on that one before I go to my second?
No, no, that kind of mirrors what I said. I do have a question for you though, but
Sure.
I'll let you finish your second point.
Okay. My second point is I'm not going to call it luck because I don't think it is luck, although there is an element of good fortune involved. And I think the other factor is timeliness. I think that most of these huge series, sometimes it's probably intentional by the author, and sometimes it may even be the author sensing this without consciously realizing they're doing it. But I think these series reflect some insecurity or some longing that's deeply seated in Japanese society at the time they start. And I think that people find an outlet for that in the story and the characters. And I think that it can be something positive, it can be something negative, but if they feel connected to that, even when times change for a long running series, once people have made that connection, the connection is made. Unless the quality totally jumps the shark, society may change, but that series, once people have made the connection to it, I don't think they lose it. I think Hunter x Hunter is a great example of that. So I think Luffy came along at a time, very different time in Japan, where the country was in terms of the economy and what people's aspirations were. And Luffy sort of represented a kind of go for the gold, anything is possible. I think he was very reflective of what Japan was at the time One Piece started. And I think the same is true of Demon Slayer, that it was a really rough time in Japan. It's been a rough time in Japan really for a long time now, but with no economic growth. But I think it that in a case it was people wanting to latch on to something that made them feel hopeful, that made them feel like no matter how bad things are getting, if we focus on what's possible, if we stay true to ourselves, we can get through it, any hardship. And I think then, specifically in the case of Kimetsu, and I've talked about this before, I think the pandemic hit, frankly, at a perfect time for that to go from being a kaiju to being the kaiju. I think it was already a kaiju. What turned it into the kaiju was the pandemic and what that did to people's paths for finding entertainment and getting and relieving the boredom and all the other things and anxiety. So I think that was what helped to push Kimetsu, which would have been in this episode anyway, as a kaiju, to be the kaiju of the post One Piece era. Now, so those are the two things I would point to as being potentially important commonalities. So I'll turn the floor over to you for your thoughts on that.
That's a really good point, actually. I didn't initially think of that, but almost like what appeals to Japanese society's like wants or fantasies, or like what differs from the reality at that specific time. I think that is a kind of a crucial element. I know we're talking specifically about shonen here, but even if I think to some of these more like slice of life or low key series that show just like these positive experiences that people have, or even like going to isekai, going to a different world. It, each of them kind of tickles something else for a different person that maybe they want
Mm.
out of their own life. So yeah, I think you're kind of on the money with that one. That makes complete sense. What I did want
All
to ask
right.
was, because we were talking
Yes.
about Battle Shonen there for quite a bit. I'll ask you a question and I'll answer it first so you can prepare your answer because I'm
Okay.
so generous. What would you say are some of your favorite battle shonen, and do you think they qualify as big hits or not? It's just what I want to ask. Like, does that fall into that category for you? Now I'll answer by saying that my top three are in this order: Bleach, Hunter x Hunter, and One Piece. And the reason why I love all of them is they're all quite different. I've kind of touched on it with Bleach already. I think uh, the factor of coolness is already there. But beyond that, which is quite surface level reason, I think Bleach's strength is the power of the presentation and how the style is the substance. And
Mm.
there's a lot of characterization which is done visually and not necessarily told. And I would argue that some people don't pick up on that because if you don't try and give the series credit, then you can't see it. Some people say it's not there to begin with. That's where that falls. And I think it's just very efficient in the storytelling that it does. Um, Hunter x Hunter. I think for all the reasons that I love Battle Shonen, I feel like I love Hunter x Hunter specifically because it flips things. takes
Mm.
these tropes and it sticks to the tropes, but also adds in like what ifs, like what if something, what if it was a 180 or something else came into it that like tainted this idea that we have of this trope. It's almost like a quite a literary take on battle shonen, I would say. Um,
Almost a sign-any take.
I would not say that, but
Oh,
yes.
no, no, I'm sorry. It's just me poking the bear. I'm sorry.
And then One Piece. We are talking about Shonen, remember, Ansel? Shonen.
Right.
Um, One Piece, I would say, it just excels both on the micro and macro level. Micro with everything we said about Luffy, with the Straw Hats, with this like passion and like each individual story arc, but then the scope that Oda has created, this world building that's ran on for 20 plus years, and I think for the community, the theory crafting potential that like drives the
Mm,
engagement is just
mm,
so impressive.
mm.
So for me, three that I love, but also for very very different reasons, and thankfully I could say they're all very much big hits.
Yeah, which is interesting because my answer to the question is okay. Your top three are all kaiju. My top three are all kaiju too. So I don't know what that says about the relationship between quality and kaiju status, but my top three in order would be Hunter x Hunter, Rurouni Kenshin, and Boku no Hero Academia. Um, and Hunter x Hunter for all the reasons you've talked about and all the reasons we've talked about and we'll talk about in our many conversations. I don't even need to rehash that. It's the most ambitious battle shonen series ever in from a literary standpoint. I don't think there's any question about it. Rurouni Kenshin, largely because to me, Himura Kenshin is the best character in shonen manga. To me, it's that's. I mean, it's a great series generally. I think Watsuki's art, particularly, is underrated. Underrated, sneaky, phenomenally great. But the main reason why that series is at the level of stature it is for me is Kenshin. He has the greatest story arc in shonen manga. He is the best character in shonen manga in my opinion. His backstory, his life, it's a great work it's a great work of literary creation, then plain and simple. And then Hiroaka, I mean, just because I think again, Hiroaka perfectly captures the time in which it was written. It has an innocence to it that I find enormously appealing, and yet it can be very dark. And when I think when Horikoshi really wants to push the envelope thematically, he can go to some extremely interesting places with the story. I think he does that with the Stain arc particularly, but he's not afraid to ask difficult questions. And I think even more so than the other monster shonen that we've talked about, I think Horikoshi really takes some pretty hard broadsides at Japanese society, which I really respect him for. So yeah, those are my three, and they're all kaiju. Your three are all kaiju twos, and the only one on both lists was Hunter x Hunter. But yeah, I do think it's very interesting. And again, as you said, all for different reasons. Um, all right, so I want to wrap it, but we're not going to do recommendations here, and we're not going to do a series rating, which is the way we usually close these episodes. So the way I want to close the episode is with this question: excluding the series we've already called out in our next big thing, various discussions. So obviously, no Gachiakuta or Sakamoto or Tokyo Aliens or Kindergarten Wars, but what current shonen title do you think has the best chance to become a kaiju, excluding those that we've already talked about? I'll go first to give you time to think about it. And my answer is an unsurprising one. I apologize if I'm stealing your thunder, but it's Kagurabachi. Um, and
Damn
not
you.
because I know, not because it's okay to agree with me too, by the way. That's perfectly fine. We agreed on Spy Family and Chainsaw Man too.
We agree because it's
I just think,
correct.
yeah, we agree because it's correct. I just feel like it isn't necessarily any intrinsic quality of the series, which I've given a couple attempts to, and I know you say it's gotten better, but I just can't stay with it to the point where it really clicks with me. But what I kind of specialize in is watching the patterns on the commercial side the social media side, seeing what gets talked about, how it gets talked about, the evolution of the numbers, and Kagurabachi has it. It presses all the right buttons. So even if the reasons are not immediately apparent to me, although I will say I do think the artwork in Kagurabachi is very good, and he does an excellent job of paneling and like what I would call in movies cinematography. The way he stages a scene, I think is it is a he, isn't it, Kagurabachi? Or do we
Yes,
not
yes.
know? Yeah. So I do recognize elements of it that I think are quite quite outstanding. But whether I fully grasp the reasoning why or not, and it took me an awfully long time to grasp it with Kimetsu, so it's not surprising. If I look at all the leading indicators, this series is going to be a kaiju, or if it gets a good anime adaptation, it's going to be a kaiju. That would be my feeling. Now, Samu, what's your answer, and why is it Kagurabachi?
So my answer is Kagurabachi, and the reason why it's Kagurabachi, similar to what you said, I think it's just you say capturing a moment or like riding a wave, like coming at the right time. We saw that with this series because it took nothing more than the cover, the not even the cover, the preview of the issue before, one single image, because this didn't have a one shot that it was based entirely off of. For this to just gain this fandom online, it very much superficially. There are people who I think genuinely just saw this and were like, okay, this could be the next big thing. This could be the next Battle Shonen. And enough people had that mindset that they went into it and kind of helped create it become that. I think there were also people who saw that and were found the whole thing ridiculous and were very skeptical of it. But I have seen a lot of people come around to it as it's gone on. I think looking at the series itself, why I think it is doing so well. You say the artwork, that makes sense to me, and I do agree that it has a very cinematic quality. Takeru Hokuzono, the author, he is quite young. He's in his early 20s, I believe. He has said that like Hollywood Western movies are a big influence for him, and I see that in his presentation, and I think that maybe also is why it's appealing not just in Japan but overseas on a massive
Mm,
level, like from the jump.
mm,
Um,
so to speak.
it's not a shonen series and it's not even a manga, but I think of something like Cowboy Bebop, which appeals to Western anime fans in just a way that clicks. It just makes
Yeah,
sense to
because
them.
Watanabe is a huge fan of Western cinema for much the same reasons. That's why it does those things.
Yeah, so very, very different series, but I think it
Of
has that
course.
same appeal. So it has the broad appeal covered, sales covered. It's still,
Yeah.
it, we'll see where it caps off at pre-anime, but we'll go from there.
Yeah.
I think what is
And it sure
interesting,
as hell has the cool factor too. It sure as hell has the cool factor too. And
100%.
no series has ever had a cool factor bigger than Cowboy Bebop, by the way.
Mm, mm. I think is what is kind of a little bit different from the series, even though it is quite conventional, is the main character. So I would say
Mm,
with Chihiro in particular, he does fall into this category of what we described as a main character you want to root for on his quest, but his quest is one of revenge, and the series is quite dark as a result of that. Um,
mm,
and Chihiro's personality, I would say, is quite different from almost all of these major kaiju, in that Chihiro is the straight man. Chihiro is the straight faced, doesn't show much emotion. It takes the rest of the supporting cast around him to bring something out of him, and I think it's usually flipped in some way. Gon is not the straight man. It's the other characters that like react to Gon, which kind of makes their
mm,
interaction so fun.
mm.
Whereas that's the opposite way around with Kagurabachi. Whether that I think that does kind of actually appeal to people, just this properly stoic, cool main character. Though I do wonder if maybe that will have some limitations in the end as
Well,
well.
it's not as if this is a topic we'll ever discuss at length, but I think Adachi protagonists have a little bit of that quality to them too. But who knows? That may be a topic for another discussion. Before we finish, I want to say first of all, thank you very much. It's been a phenomenal conversation. I really enjoyed it. But you mentioned that Western influence, and I actually think maybe if we look back at these kaiju, a lot of them actually do have mangaka who are big fans of Western cinema. Kaiju or near Kaiju. We know Fujimoto, for example, is a huge fan of Western cinema. We know that
Yeah.
Horikoshi is a huge fan of Western cinema and Western comic books. We Oda is a big fan of Western cinema as well and Western comics. So, do you think maybe there is a little bit of that too? That maybe that gives a series a little extra push if it has a little bit of that Hollywood sensibility to it?
Yeah, I'm sure there's a little. Yeah, I'm sure there is a bit of that. I mean, a series can be a kaiju and not be massive worldwide.
Absolutely.
There are quite a few examples of that, but all the pretty much all the series we discussed have managed to cross over in ways that, yeah, it just appeals to people outside of Japan. So yeah, I think there's definitely truth to that. Fujimoto is a
Yeah.
very good one. People will know this if they're familiar with his work. There is usually, at least in all of his long running series and quite a lot of his one shots, there's an iconic scene where the characters are in a cinema. So he very much
Mm,
uses
mm, mm,
cinema
mm, mm,
and
mm.
movies as part of development of characters as well.
Yeah, yeah, that's very interesting that you should point that out. Well, anyway, so this is one of those interesting topics that you could go on for hours about, but I think that's a good place to leave it. And I will say that reflecting on our reflecting on our next big thing telecast from a while ago, I'm still very comfortable with both my picks, but I'm really feeling the Gachiakuta momentum now. I'm really feeling like if this anime is as phenomenal and bonesy as I suspect it's going to be, I'm feeling like there's intrinsic elements in this series that we've talked about tonight that I think Gachiakuta does have some of them, and I think that was a good call for you to pick that in our show. It was my first runner up, and yeah, I think that was a good pick. I think Gachiakuda has a real shot because I
Yeah, I
think
think
that has a chance to be a Heavenly Delusion level adaptation, and it's a much bigger commercial property potentially just intrinsically than Heavenly Delusion is. So
with Gachiakuta, I mean, it's worth noting that pre-anime, its volume sales are not amazing. I don't have them in front of me at the moment, but
but they're good.
it's somewhere in like 10 to 20k range, around there, I believe. So I think it will get a boost, definitely. It, I think it's also in contention for having probably one of the best adaptations of the year for going based on predictions. And I was saying this to you earlier, but I've been catching up with the manga recently. And even though
Yes.
this would be season 2 content by the point we're at now, I do think the series has even gotten better as it's gone on. So, yes, the sky's the limit as it is for the characters within the series.
Yeah, I think so. I think for for a series that's a non-jump shonen. I think it has. I think it has a chance. I think it has a chance to go to that next level. But we'll see. In any event, thank you very much, Samu. It's been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it. And I want to just say again, uh, as always, we would love to see your comments either on LIA, on YouTube, depending on how you consume the podcast, one of our many podcast providers. But if you comment, I will be sure to reply to it because we love to get your feedback and your own thoughts, especially on something like this. Your feedback, your own suggestions, would love to hear those. And Samu, thanks very much for some very interesting conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a kind of an unanswerable question, but I
Yep.
think we've taken a good stab at it.
Yeah, those are the most interesting questions to try to answer. So, okay, thank you, everyone. And as always, if you could if you could comment, and could subscribe, actionables as they call them, that would certainly help. Certainly help the cause. And talk to you soon.